Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Nick Fasano. I work with Professor Julia Mikolova, and today I'm happy to present that research day on our recent work involving experimental and numerical techniques for high-order harmonic generation from relativistic plasma mirrors. So relativistic harmonic generation is a physical phenomena where when you focus intense light onto a solid target, XUV radiation is emitted in the specular direction in the form of harmonics, where harmonics are integer multiples of the laser frequency. So here I show an experimentally measured harmonic spectrum, where these bright lines are indicative of each harmonic, which again are just integer multiples of the laser frequency. So the goal of this talk is to discuss our approaches for achieving enhanced harmonic generation. But first, so harmonics themselves are not unique to light or to relativistic plasma mirrors. In fact, harmonics themselves are found everywhere in nature. So for example, from music, you find harmonics when you pluck a string on a stringed instrument like a violin. So when you pluck, for example, the G string, you don't just hear the note at the fundamental note, but you actually hear the harmonics of that string too. Another example from wildlife is found in a tiger's roar. So if you were to record a tiger's roar and analyze it in the frequency domain, what you will find is again a harmonic-like spectrum. So here I show a spectrogram of the harmonics of the tiger's roar, where frequency is plotted along the vertical axis and delay effectively the time between the tiger's roar plotted on the horizontal axis. And then these black spots are indicative of the frequency generation there, which you see the harmonics. So what I'd like to say about this is that in general, analyzing signals in both the time and the frequency domain can provide valuable insights into the origin of the signal, as well as to what it actually emitted it. So for example, in the tiger case, analyzing such a spectrogram can tell you information about the tiger, such as its gender, its age, whether it's under stress or not, without actually seeing the tiger. So to bring it back to relativistic harmonics, I'd like to provide an overview of the talk for the rest of the talk, as well as what we study in the lab in general. So our approach to achieving harmonic generation is to use waveform-controlled lasers. I will explain what that means in more detail in subsequent slides. But here I show another example of an experimentally measured relativistic harmonic spectrum, which you should now see the sort of contrast between this and the violin spectrum. They are very similar shape. So although the talk is mostly about our experimental approach, I'd also like to just briefly highlight our numerical and theoretical work, where we have used particle and cell simulations to extend the theory of harmonic generation, which has important implications on the ultimate efficiency of the process. And I'd be happy to answer questions about this after the talk, if they arise. But relativistic harmonic generation in general, why do we care? So I show here a schematic setup of what an experiment might look like, where you take a laser and you focus it to a very small spot size on a solid target. And because of the high intensities that are generated, the electrons at the plasma are accelerated to relativistic speeds. And what we find is that when you look at the reflected beam, these relativistic electrons emit coherent and broad bandwidth XUV radiation. So I say coherent and broad bandwidth, but what do those words mean? To understand that, we can just consider simple properties of the Fourier transform. So if you look at a signal in the frequency domain, and it's broad bandwidth, and furthermore it's coherence, by that I mean it's phase matched, so all the individual colors or frequencies have the same phase, then when you sum up all these frequencies and go back to the time domain, you're left with a very short spike. And so for us, this XUV spectrum that we measure produces attosecond spikes in the time domain, where an attosecond is 10 to the minus 18 seconds. But we don't see just a continuous spectrum like this. We actually measure a harmonic spectrum. And this, again, can be understood through properties of the Fourier transform, where if in time, if you have just a single spike, you have a train of spikes with some fixed period between them. When you Fourier transform to the frequency domain, this exhibits a harmonic spectrum. And this is the origin of the harmonic spectrum that we observe. The idea is that because we have a multi-cycle laser pulse, but the out-of-second pulses are emitted every cycle, we have a train of out-of-second pulses rather than just a single isolated. So in addition to being a useful secondary radiation source, for example, for studying electron dynamics, harmonic generation is also useful for relativistic plasma dynamics, a diagnostic for relativistic plasma dynamics. So just like we use the tiger's roar, analyzing the frequency domain to back out characteristics about the tiger, we can use the relativistic harmonic spectrum that we measure in the lab to back out properties about the relativistic plasma dynamics. So here I show the generation process from PIC simulations to illustrate it a bit more clearly. So we start off with a femtosecond laser pulse, which is given by the blue curve. We reflect it from a plasma mirror, and we look at the reflected beam. And we see that the reflected beam is a bit distorted and has this triangular waveform, which is indicative of high-frequency generation. Sure enough, when we transform to the frequency domain, we observe, again, this harmonic spectrum with a parallel law scaling. And like I mentioned before, what we'd like to do is we'd like to sum together a broad bandwidth of these harmonics. This can be done by, for example, filtering out the earlier harmonics and only considering the harmonics from the 10th to the 100th order, and summing those together, transforming back to the time domain, reveals the out-of-second pulse train. So that is sort of the overview of the harmonic generation, why we care. What I'd like to discuss now is our approach in the lab, both theory and experimentally, to achieving enhanced harmonic generation. And our approach is to use waveform-controlled engineering. So the idea is, so the question is can we engineer the perfect waveform for optimizing relativistic harmonic efficiency? How do we do this, both theoretically and practically, is what I will discuss. So in a more theoretical sense, the idea is we would like to take not only the fundamental harmonic, but we'd like to add to that some fraction of second harmonic, third harmonic, fourth harmonic, and higher harmonics to construct a multicolor waveform. I show an example here using two-color beam. So we have the fundamental red and the second harmonic blue, and we sum them together to produce this unique waveform. And by controlling the phase, the relative phase between the two colors, we can effectively construct any waveform we want. The utility of two-color beams is that by tailoring the light field, we can effectively optimize the electric field waveform at particular times during the harmonic generation process to achieve the highest electron velocities and accelerations, which then corresponds to the highest harmonic generation efficiency. So this problem has been studied in the past by our group and others, and the answer to the question is yes, we can use waveform-controlled engineering to enhance harmonic efficiency. Particle and cell simulations validate this. What we would like to do now is explain the experimental approach to how we actually create such waveforms. So maybe you kind of have an idea of where I'm going with this. I mentioned that we can use plasma mirrors to generate harmonics. And so what we'd like to do is use plasma mirrors as the waveform generator themselves. So the idea is to have a cascaded plasma mirror configuration where the first plasma mirror creates a multicolor light waveform, and which is then subsequently interacts with a second plasma mirror to generate enhanced harmonic efficiencies. I show here our experimental setup in schematic form, where we have 3 plasma mirrors in our setup. The first plasma mirror is a non-relativistic plasma mirror. It doesn't generate harmonics. it's mainly used for temporal contrast enhancement to eliminate unwanted prepulses. Afterward, the beam is sent to a second plasma mirror. This is our first relativistic plasma mirror in the setup, and it's used to generate a multicolor light waveform. In principle, harmonics orders from the fundamentals through the XUV are generated. However, because of the beam transport, all higher order harmonics are lost, and we're only left with a two-color light waveform. We can then send this beam to the main plasma mirror target, so the third one and the second relativistic mirror in our setup, or we can kick out the two-color terawatt beam and measure some characteristics of it, such as the pulse duration and the near field, far field, as well as the temporal contrast pulse. Here I show two experimental measurements involving measuring the pulse duration given by the pulse spectrogram, which is useful for extracting the phase information about the waveform, in addition to the near field images of both the fundamental red and second harmonic blue. So if we bypass that beam diagnostics line and send the laser to the third plasma mirror, the second relativistic plasma mirror in the setup, we can then measure the enhancement of harmonic efficiency using this two-color beam. The diagnostics we have set up for this include two spectrometers, which span the range from 5 nanometers to 1100 nanometers. That's an XUV spectrometer and a visible spectrometer. In addition, we can insert a scattering screen in the beam path to image the low-order harmonics, such as the fundamental and second harmonic that I show here. And on the left, I show an image from our spectrometer showing the first 4 harmonics generated from this two-color beam. So with that, I would just like to summarize what I have told you. So relativistic harmonic generation is a useful source for coherent XUV radiation. Our approach to this is to use waveform-controlled engineering for harmonic efficiency enhancement. So far, to date, we have constructed a two-color terawatt beam, and in addition, we have measured relativistic spectrum from relativistic harmonic generation using a single-color beam. And in the future, we hope to demonstrate the utility of a two-color driving laser for harmonic efficiency of both low-order harmonics as well as relativistic harmonics. And with that, I'm out of time, so I'd like to thank you for your attention, and to also thank everyone who has contributed to this work, and that I'd be happy to answer any questions.